The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Marc Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Marc Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
Today we're here to talk about AI and disruptive technologies more widely, about what kind of world we're building and in whose interests. We're meeting at a moment when we know the pace of tech change is outstripping the capacity of governments, of businesses and societies to adapt. Across societies, we're racing to build and deploy new tools without fully understanding their consequences. But today's conversation isn't about the technology itself, about the productivity and efficiency that it unlocks, and it's not about the direct operational impacts. Instead, our focus is on power, governance and responsibility, exploring how technology is transforming economies and democracies, and the risks and opportunities that this is creating, and what kind of leadership is needed now. And we're joined today by Thomas Lingard, Executive Director of the Centre for Future Generations, a Brussels-based institute that's focused on the social and political implications of emerging technologies. After 25 years at Unilever of leading work on climate and sustainability, he's now bringing that experience to the frontier of tech governance, asking how we can design markets and institutions that keep pace with exponential technologies.
So, Thomas, welcome. Could you give us a sense of why this particular area of emerging technologies has interested you and how you moved into it?
I grew up around a lot of technology. My dad worked in IT. I remember, I guess it was the 80s, we were one of the first kids in the class to get a PC at home. So I got quite geeky in my early days about technology. It was something that had real fascination, a real sense of the future. I guess as somebody who's approaching the big 5-0, I've lived through this era where technology has been this enormous shaping force in the world that I've grown up in. And actually, when I joined Unilever, people know me as the ex-Unilever sustainability guy. But I actually joined in IT and finance and worked on IT systems. And I imagined that I might do that for my whole career had I not then got super interested and worried about what was happening in sustainability, which led me to move into that space. But I was always a very business-centric person. And it wasn't really until I went on secondment from Unilever to Green Alliance, a policy think tank in the UK, that I went, oh, wow, there's all these people over here that think it's not all about business. It's about policy. It's about how policy shapes markets and shapes the world in which we live. And then when I went back to Unilever in 2010 into the global team, I then tried to fuse those two worlds. It's like, okay, well, we should be doing more as Unilever to shape the sustainability policy landscape, because actually that is what is driving what businesses do and don't do. You can go so far on a kind of what you want to do within the constraints of the market, but if the market is set up in a way as to make something more profitable or less profitable, you will go towards what is more profitable. That's just how we set up in the capitalist system. So yes, got very interested in the regulation of climate and how policy affects what companies do on climate. And then in a very left field report from a brilliant think tank NGO called Influence Map around 2018, this was, They normally track corporate influence on climate change, but they've done a very unusual report for them on the influence of tech companies on climate, not through their infrastructural footprint, but through climate misinformation and disinformation that was being hosted on social media platforms, and the role in those platforms and the algorithms in shaping the narrative around climate and climate policy in a way that was actually then becoming very, very problematic. And this was like a real moment for me to go, oh, hang on, all that technology stuff I was super into may now be the problem in our ability to address some of these systemic issues. And I realized I didn't know very much about that. I wanted to go and learn more about that. I did a master's in AI ethics that had just been launched at Cambridge. And I became absolutely convinced that this was at least the biggest problem as climate change, because we are at risk of losing control over our information systems, which is how we understand the world, which is therefore how we make decisions about the world, and decided I wanted to pivot into that space.
So right now, what are the questions that you're most focused on?
So I arrived leading a think tank working on emerging technology governance. We are thinking collectively around our sort of organizational mission question is how do we help policymakers anticipate and govern rapid technological change? And the thing that is most obvious about what's happening now is the speed at which it's happening. These are very, very complex technologies and they are evolving very, very quickly. Whether this is at the national level or at the European level, it is very, very challenging to be trying to regulate and govern technologies that are evolving almost on a weekly basis. So this is the challenge that we are thinking about, and we do that from a basis of having a team of people who understand the technologies but have also got experience in business, in policy making, in philosophy and ethics, and all sorts of a very interdisciplinary team. And so we're trying to bring that to the surface of policymakers, primarily in Europe, but also in the UK, as they think about how do we regulate these things. Personally, I'm thinking about what can I bring from a couple of decades thinking about sustainability and climate change, because one of the things that hits you when you walk through the door is all of the words are different, but all of the dynamics feel identical. You have industry actors with vested interests. You have policymakers who are a little bit, rabbit in the headlights sometimes. You have a civil society group that's kind of campaigning largely against everything. And these dynamics feel very familiar, even though all the words are different. And so I'm trying to work out how can we not repeat the sort of 20 years of things that didn't work on climate and sustainability and bring those into our approach to tech governance.
Does the fact there are different spaces and different silos and different conversations about the future, does that matter? I was really struck when I last year recognised that we, and I say we as an organisation that's been working broadly with business and sustainability, we're facing huge headwinds. The leadership agendas are being dominated by geopolitics and AI, and we didn't have a clear enough view or position about what does that mean for, our collective ability to live on a finite and fragile planet. But in trying to get people together in one room to talk about AI or to talk about geopolitics, there was a really strong sense of, well, that's not, our space. Why would we talk about that? And I'm really struck by, we've got a whole lot of tech-led conversations. We've got economics conversations on productivity and efficiency. We've got conversations by sustainability people on environmental limits. We've got a whole lot of people focused on trade wars and so on. And a lot of those conversations are not, as you say, the dynamics are the same, and in some ways, the locus, the focus on politics and state action and orchestration, in some ways are all the same. Is it a problem, the fact that it's somewhat fragmented, or is that just life?
Yes to both. So it is life. We all work in our particular bubbles, and many of us have kind of lived in one bubble or one or two bubbles for a long period of time. We've developed expertise and networks, and we understand how to navigate those. And the only way you can do that really is by blocking out some other stuff, so that you can focus. It has been a humbling experience for me to take what feels to me like a very small sidestep in one direction to a different bit of this agenda about thinking about the future, to find that all of the language is different, that there are stakeholders I'd never heard of before, that there are different government departments that are having these conversations. And it makes you realise just how big the world is, how many of these bubbles there are, all trying to wrestle with these questions about the future through their own frames, their own issues and so on. And of course, lots of other people have been having these conversations about climate change, but not making links to bigger questions of what's going on in the world. And I think, the climate community and the sustainability community can be a bit of an insulated bubble. We're nice people and we're soft people sometimes. And, we kind of like to imagine that the world's going to end at a happy place if we all do the right thing. And the reality is a little bit tougher. And the tech world doesn't suffer from that kind of fluffiness, right? It is a hard world, and it is very US driven because of the corporate cultures and the other cultures around the sort of way technology has evolved. So it's been an interesting journey for me into this space.
Thomas, let's look forward, and I'm a scenario planner at heart. If you could paint for us maybe a high, medium, and low set of scenarios for technology and its impact on society and the planet.
At the Centre for Future Generations, one of our key focuses is the application of foresight techniques to thinking about these technologies. We did do a very well-received piece of work earlier this year on AI futures. We looked at where AI capability may go, high, low, and the extent to which control over AI would be centralized or decentralized. So that gave us our sort of quadrants, and then we picked out 5 different scenarios in each of those. The default we call big AI. So this is the idea that you get this concentration of power in the big tech companies, largely controlled by them and increasing power off that AI. But we painted other scenarios too. So one where there's more of a slowdown that we called plateau, another one which is more of an arms race where governments get more involved. You play into this US-China dynamic that seems to be breaking out. Another one called Takeoff, which is more towards a kind of AGI future, if you like. And Diplomacy, of course, as well as the one in the middle. We try not to have a public preferred one, but if you read it, I think the Diplomacy one has more sort of optimism around it. It's a place where the AI is evolving, but there is also a kind of responsible conversation between governments about how that's managed. There's so much we don't know about AI, right? This is the other thing. So we know some things, but we don't know everything. And we also can't really predict exactly which way it's going to go. As you will know also, scenarios are not predictions. They're tools to help you evaluate strategies. I think one of the things that we worry about a lot is the economic impacts in terms of, yes, labour market is one, it will affect jobs, but also this concentration of wealth and power that you see coming from the current structures. There are big questions, I think, about whether the main problem at the moment is what the AI might do, or is it the quasi-monopoly structure you've got with so much concentration in a small number of companies? And what does that mean for not only income and wealth distribution, but power distribution in terms of who's getting a say in how the future is shaped? And I think something that a lot of the society, tech and democracy NGOs that are very worried about that space are very allergic to that direction of travel. Of course, you see that a lot of the R&D, a lot of the advancement in AI does require vast amounts of capital and investment, and you only get that in the private sector if you're a very large company. We've been advocating for more multilateral responses. We've been arguing for Europe to take a kind of approach to AI R&D similar to what was done on CERN. And the EU is moving forwards in that direction with a proposal called RAISE. But we think that getting more public-private partnership in that space, having some nation-state control over the AI development will be a good thing from a public good perspective.
So which outcomes do you think are more plausible now when you run those scenarios? If you can give us some sense of probabilities.
I am not a probabilities guy. I think we're on track at the moment for this kind of big AI scenario. And this is kind of why we recognize that policymakers are having a hard job calling how to deal with this from a policy and regulation point of view. It's not only about regulating, but it's also the policy frameworks one creates in different markets. One of the things we think about a lot is it is becoming a little bit of a US-China arms race. If you look at across the world, if you would expect there to be a more kind of values-driven approach to AI and thinking about the impacts, not only the financial valuations or the military advantages, you would expect that to come from Europe, perhaps more than the US or China. But Europe is not yet where it needs to be in technology innovation. We haven't really got the European single market off the ground. We've got it in name only, but not in terms of if you try and run a company across Europe, you still need multiple legal entities, multiple capital markets. It gets very complex. So we're doing some work at the moment also on what would it take to actually get a kind of startup ecosystem, a technology development ecosystem in Europe that could rival or at least compete with the US and China and actually create some EU sovereignty around technology.
What would the big signals be about which course we're tending to move on?
Well, I think about the interplay between the technology and the politics. And that's what's been interesting and concerning about what you've seen in the US and when those things get very close together. I think the biggest threat to our ability as society to manage this for the public good long term is our ability to have information about what's happening so that we can have informed conversations. So, a lot of the people working in AI are very focused on the technical questions around AI and moving towards superintelligence and what would that mean. I think before we get there, we've got some very pressing concerns to deal with around, are policymakers able to make unbiased decisions? Are they getting input that reflects society? So I spend a lot of time looking at what's happening in that information ecosystem. How secure are the processes around policy development? You see a lot of narrative around, we've got to do this very quickly, so we're going to bypass all of our normal processes and due process in consultation and which groups we invite in to comment on this. I think that's very dangerous. In Europe, it's maybe not quite so pronounced as in the US, but there is definitely this sense of a slide towards a kind of more authoritarian, just let the governments and the companies get on with it, which I think could be detrimental long-term for society.
So, Thomas, just listening to those scenarios, it makes me think about Kahneman's work, thinking fast, thinking slow. And there seems to be a lot of thinking fast going on, which usually means that there's a range of errors that we are going to make. And we would love to be able to think slow, move past some of those filters and immediate biases, that those cognitive structures that put in place. Are we, in a way, trapped in a technological acceleration, an innovative trajectory, which is happening so fast that we can only but think fast, and we can't really slow down to really consider the ethical and governance-related requirements? How can we slow down? And if we can't, are we not in big trouble?
It's a great question. I spent some time at a Zen monastery last month, and one of the brothers there was, I think, quoting his Zen master saying, if it's really, really urgent, the best thing to do is to slow down. But you're right, things are moving very fast. There is this sense of an accelerationist dynamic, particularly fueled by, anything that gets loaded with a geopolitical or a military worry. Suddenly anything becomes possible, right? People want to just race ahead from a security point of view, economic and military. And that is very difficult to counter. But at the same time, there will be people here in 10 years' time thinking about these issues. And so it's important also to have future generations, that's in the name of our organisation, in mind when thinking about the decisions and on what kind of future are we building and what kind of future do we want. And there are choices that we can make. Perhaps one of the greatest tools is just the mindset that we as society are still in control of our own destiny. There is a sense of techno-determinism sometimes. That sense of techno-determinism is also foisted on us by the commercial vested interest. It sounds quite a lot like, yes, but of course fossil fuels will be around for the next 100 years. That's very obvious sort of narrative you get from the fossil fuel companies. And again, this is where the parallels between the climate and the tech become really helpful, because we know what these narratives sound like, and we know they can feel very hard to argue against when they're so well put together and rehearsed. But we can absolutely choose to do things differently if we want, and we can build different kinds of economies in some parts of the world to the others. And we shouldn't forget that we have that agency. I think it's super interesting if you saw the data recently around how social media use is dropping off, on the Facebooks and the Instagrams of the world. Young people are kind of like, they've had enough of this kind of slop that's coming on their phones, and they're spending more time together with each other. So it's always kind of hard to know exactly where you are in a change curve. Any exponential curve, it's hard to look forwards, but when you look back, it looks like you're at the top of the curve. So it feels like we are going to continue accelerating, but we also may not. We may have a human response to what's going on around us that results in different generations thinking differently about technology, wanting different things, empowering politicians to do things that at the moment look difficult.
I think it's really important, a reminder about agency, whether it's tech determinism or whether it's around just some of the really hard pushback and backlash against action to address environment or climate. And people can get a bit fatalistic and in some places almost give up or are silenced or stay quiet. So you've laid out, we can absolutely do something different, but how might that play out? What might that look like if we think it's important not to just say, look, those with huge financial power or kind of raw military power will just dominate? If you could tell a story of how you think it might play out so we could nudge, steer, deploy tech in ways that are good for society.
I think it's a really important point, and we are also very clear as an organisation that we are not techno-pessimists, nor are we techno-optimists. It's all about that messy middle. Clearly, one of the drivers of the techno-determinism is the way that the technology companies have really captured the minds of the financial community, these crazy valuations of these tech companies, which suggest that people are banking on them being the future economy. But other economies that are also potentially very fast growing and potentially technology driven are also possible. We have a team looking at biotechnology. I think that's one area also where Europe has a comparative advantage. We've got great bioscience resources here in the UK and in Europe. And it could be a real engine for growth. It has both medical applications, also defense applications. There is unfortunately some scary stuff happening in biotech and defense as well. But in order to both develop European security around risks from bioweapons and deal with some of the medical issues that you can deal with through biotechnology. There's a whole sector there waiting to be grown that could be very fast growing, very exciting, deliver lots of the same economic benefits that some of the other sort of data processing is talked about, but could be controlled and regulated in such a way as we do with medicines that is more pro-social.
Back to the reason why you stepped into this space, I'm interested in how we might get to a more positive story in relation to those risks that you are highlighting. Is there potential for there to be better governance or more responsibility? Do you think that's even viable right now?
Yes. I mean, it has to be, right? It has to be. And we have to have the courage of our convictions that we can imagine a different setup and a different way of this working. I think some of the failure of the climate movement has been to imagine and sell a vision of that low carbon net zero future. It took us a long time to be able to describe that in really positive, attractive terms. It always felt like giving something up. And I think in the same way, people who are worried about technology and information, we need to do a better job of imagining what this looks like and sharing examples of where it works. Well, I saw Audrey Tang do a presentation. So Audrey Tang was, I think, the digital minister in Taiwan during the COVID crisis. Taiwan had this amazing response to COVID because they used a technological platform to allow citizens to input to the response in real time. So things could move very, very quickly in a way that other countries, were going through more bureaucratic processes. And I remember she shared one example of a kid writing in saying, the boys in my school are not wearing the masks. All the masks in Taiwan were pink. And the boys don't want to wear these masks because they're pink. And literally the next morning on national TV, they had the national men's basketball team appear wearing pink masks. And that problem was fixed overnight. So using technology can be a great way to get more participatory democratic processes. We don't really know what they look like because most of us have not really experienced them. But I think if we can start to shape a vision of technology as a pro-social, pro-community apparatus, not something that is owned offshore by a very large tech company with a very extractive data business model. We can use these technologies, but in a different way and in a way that works for us, not just to have our data extracted.
And where will leadership need to come from on that? Is that going to have to come from within the public sector for us to move forward?
I think we're going to need upskilling on these issues in every sector, including in the public sector, but also in the private sector, also in the civil society sector. I remember coming on the early sustainability courses that CISL wrote, and you kind of think, I'm going to learn about sustainability, and you learn nothing about sustainability. You learn all about power and systems and change and how the world works, and you come away a much richer person. So we're going to need the same on tech, and we're going to have programs that open people's eyes to what might be different. Again, supported by think tanks like Centre for Future Generations and others who are doing this work to say, look, there are different options available here. You don't have to follow the road that looks most obvious. There are alternatives available.
So we're having this conversation now at a time when headlines are absolutely dominated by the valuations of big tech and a huge discussion of bubbles. And it seems that the bubble is continuing to grow. And either all the huge promises of the tech firms will play out and be true, and we will see massive shifts across economies with huge implications, or all of those calling it will be right, and we'll have a huge potential financial crisis. I'm just interested in how you read the context right now.
It's a great question. We actually put out a report recently called Beyond the AI Hype, looking at kind of what was real and not real. It seems to us there's no question that there is some overvaluation. You would expect that not all of those can be true. There will be some winners and losers, and some may be good bets and some may be less so. And it is very hard to predict how this thing will go. But it seems very likely there will be some sort of cyclical, false starts and crashes and starts again. I was reminded recently that the first coal power plant in London opened in 1882, and it shut down not very many years later in 1886 after running up massive losses, right? But that fact doesn't tell you very much about what went on to be the future of that technology over the following 150 years or so. It's going to be messy, and that could be about which parts of the world are they in. It could be where regulation comes down. I think what is interesting about the current wave of AI research is how private sector led it has been. In the early work on AI was actually much more government driven through innovation agencies, particularly in the US, but also in other countries, which kind of has different incentives, it has different purpose behind it. And when you put the pressure of the capital markets into these AI companies, as soon as you've got these valuations, right, you have to maintain them, right? You have to have a narrative that maintains them. You have to have investment that you hope will deliver those returns over time. And it becomes very, very focused on delivering the promise of capitalism, right? Not necessarily on what is the most social good outcome. And if we're thinking about these ultra powerful technologies at a time of crisis in the world, we must also be asking ourselves the question, what is it we need to do to orientate those technologies to the things we are most worried about, whether that's climate, whether that's wealth distribution in a world that's becoming incredibly unequal and unfair. So there's lots of great things that AI could help us do, but it's not at all guaranteed that it will unless we accept our agency in shaping that future.
The genie's out of the bottle and it's everywhere. So it's way too late to take the precautionary approach that is often taken with new technologies being released into the market. So where does that leave approaches now? Is it about being agile in response? How should leaders, decision makers be thinking about this?
The information gap seems to me to be the biggest problem. You have such a concentration, not only of wealth, but of knowledge and understanding of these technologies within the companies. The regulators are massively underpowered in terms of their ability to even keep up with those developments. So we need to think about ways to upskill the people who are charged with regulating. And if we can, to do that without the kind of revolving door problems you had in the evolution of energy legislation, where so many people were coming in and out of the energy sector into government that the assumptions of the companies were baked into the regulatory approaches. So we need maybe it's a three-way revolving door with the NGOs that have deep expertise in the issues, as well as the companies and governments working together. We definitely think there's more that can be done in governments working together and pooling knowledge. The UK AI Safety Summit that Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, convened here was generally seen to be something of a success in starting this sort of multilateral conversation about AI regulation. The more we can get countries thinking of this as a multilateral public good, as opposed to a nation versus nation race dynamic, that will also help feed into the kinds of approaches that get taken, and also steel those countries against some of the inevitable pushes you are already seeing from tech companies and governments representing those tech companies, like if you don't drop all your regulation, we will not trade with you or invest in your countries, right? That kind of bullying tactic. So we need to get more people doing more stuff together to sort of heighten the common interest in all of this technology, and not only let this be played off by national and market race dynamics.
I'm interested in what you think Europe's story could be in this. You opened by characterising this as there's a big competition between the US and China. This conversation is not only about Europe, but we happen to be having it in Europe at a time when Europe is completely riven with challenges and competing views on whether what we need to do is completely deregulate and accelerate innovation versus really lean on and protect our strong social foundations. And we've got this rich tradition of good governance and so on. What do you think Europe's story could be so Europe doesn't end up just being a pawn in a much bigger game?
Well, we're not a big fan of binary logics that say it's either growth and investment or it's human rights, sustainability, responsibility. So we believe that there is a path for Europe that does both. It's not very well developed, partly because, again, the narratives are being used to attack regulation because they will save companies money and make it easier for them to extract data and so on. But absolutely Europe, and I include the UK and the European continent in this, has got to find a way to deliver growth. But we've got to think about what that growth is for, who that growth is for, and what it looks like. And there are choices that we can make there. And whether that's about saying, well, we're going to double down on particular sectors where we've got comparative advantage like biotech, or whether it's about encouraging the growth of certain sorts of AI applied to, solving critical problems. But I don't think we have to throw away all hope of regulating this. And it's not only about regulation, right? It's policy and regulation. There is a lot of regulation in Europe. I'm not saying there aren't things that could be simplified and made easier for companies to comply with, but there are policies that Europe can take too that would make it easier for homegrown European tech companies to thrive in European markets, not constrained, but shaped by European values.
If we close our conversation by inviting leaders to step into the kind of mindset that you think would most help navigate the governance tightrope, what would that mindset be that you would invite from the leaders?
I think we need to step up our humility. We just don't know where all of this is going. We just don't know what good looks like in some ways. We are being fed a narrative that if we get more of this, it will solve all of our problems. So we should drop everything and just let it happen. I've heard people say, oh, don't worry about the environmental footprint of AI, because if we achieve X, Y, Z, we'll solve all the environmental issues. I am deeply skeptical of that narrative. Even if there was a chance that it were true, it's a big bet to take. So we need to, all of us, ask the question, are we sure? Do we know? Do we need to get more granular in our assessment of what's likely and not likely? And as we all know, there are some things that are very unlikely, but if they happen, they're very bad. And should we be taking precautionary steps to ensure against them, even if we think on balance something good might happen?
You've talked a lot in this conversation about agency. Just as a closing reflection, what would your encouragement be right now to leaders about the agency that they currently have?
Well, I think leaders are faced with a lot of very tricky decisions in a period of wild uncertainty. And so that is challenging. One thing I was always encouraged to think about when making decisions is, are these one-way doors or two-way doors? There are some things where you can say, okay, we'll go in this route, go through this door, and if it doesn't work or if something bad happens, we can come back. But there are also one-way doors that once you've gone through it, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get back. And I think in some of the AI policy and regulatory spaces, we are now coming towards some one-way doors where if we give up rights, if we give up access in Europe and the UK in favour of some promised AI utopia, we may not be able to get that back because the technology at that point may take over and control the power structures that would otherwise allow societies to reclaim control.
Thanks so much, Thomas, for joining us. Really rich conversation. It's clear that there's a huge range of possible futures, that AI is not guaranteed to be good, to provide that utopian future that might be promised by some, but nor is it guaranteed to be bad. But it's guaranteed, and certainly change is absolutely inevitable. We've heard really powerfully from you about some of the potential that exists genuinely for technology to be embraced for good, and the importance of not giving in to the hype, not giving in to some of the deterministic messages, and importantly, to not give up on some really fundamental principles. But also the importance of being humble. Really important point about upskilling, about the importance of imagination, the ability to imagine a better future in which technology is harnessed for society. But that really involves leaning in, embracing technology rather than just fearing it and denying the reality of the huge impact that it's likely to have on society. Thank you. Join us next time for What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Marc Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.